Welcome to the latest edition of USC Trojans Primetime Live. He's Ethan Inman. I'm Matt Zemek coming at you Wednesday night and talking about USC football, the latest that's going on now. You know, a prominent college basketball commentator is fond of saying, we sleep in May. Well, May is a relatively slow month in terms of the college football news cycle. Now, nationally, there are some interesting things happening in terms of television scheduling. You know, the ESPN and Fox are dropping their week one selections. So those are becoming known. USC's not playing a big time game in week one, unlike last year. Last year was the big LSU game in Las Vegas on Labor Day Sunday. USC's not playing a big hitter in week one. So USC's kind of outside the big news cycle in terms of early season schedules. So, Ethan, we're left to deal with, recruiting, which that is the main topic. It's the main point of focus. And we're going to have continued discussions about a lot of the same things in recruiting. And so the big news, Xavier Griffin decommits. So USC loses a prime recruit. But, we talked about this last week. And we're going to talk about it in the future, too. This is not going away. That, retaining everyone, not going to happen. We should all be ready for that. We should expect that. We should have that in our minds. It's not really about 100% retention. It's, I guess, one question for you, as I ask you about Xavier Griffin specifically. The bigger background question is, what is a good retention rate? What is a good retention percentage? But first, talk about Xavier Griffin, and then you can perhaps talk about that bigger topic of retention percentage at USC.
Sounds good, Matt. Well, it's obviously a bummer whenever you lose somebody like Xavier Griffin, right? I mean, he's one of the top defensive players in the 2026 class and one of the headliners for USC, obviously, in the class. And so it's a bummer for them to lose somebody like that. One positive news story that kind of came out of this was, a lot of top national media outlets were reporting that this kind of all came about because USC has a policy against committed prospects taking official visits to other campuses. And it was because he had those official visits scheduled with places like Alabama, Florida State, Georgia, and Texas that, USC kind of said, we're not cool with that. And so he had to decommit if he wanted to explore those options. So, I mean, I think that's kind of, a positive thing to take from this. I don't, if you're a program like USC, you don't want your players with a kind of half in, half out, 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out the door. You want them to be 100% in all the time. And I think that, we kind of have talked about several times how Chad Bowden has really emphasized in his media appearances, building a wall around Southern California and also recruiting people who want to be Trojans. And I think that this is kind of another indication of that USC is kind of doubling down on, we want people who want to be here, which is hard to find in today's college football landscape with all the NIL, with all the, free transfer portal, free market kind of craziness that always goes on. But so I think that's kind of positive. I think that it's a sign that USC is, if USC was in a worse place with commitments, maybe they don't stick as hard to this rule and they kind of, try to keep him happy and abate some of his worries and be like, yeah, we want you here, but we can't stop you from going and exploring those other options. But, it seems USC believes in some of their other talent and they are allowing themselves to be a little bit picky and allowing themselves to set some rules like this, where you have to be if you're going to commit here, you have to be here. You have to be fully bought in, and we don't want anybody who's not fully bought in. So hopefully that that kind of mindset kind of pays off for them for sure.
So, this theme of, USC needing to recruit people who want to be Trojans, that mantra, that point of emphasis, Lincoln Riley was talking about this last year. So it's not as though this is something new, at least in terms of what's being said publicly and in terms of how the Lincoln Riley regime, and including Riley himself, markets the program, how he talks about the program in front of a microphone, in front of a camera. So this is not new. I mean, and when we talk about the direction of USC football, and we're going to get into this more later in the show on other levels, but it's the continuing point of fascination that how much of this is Lincoln Riley learning, evolving, growing, because maybe that's happening. Maybe he is understanding a few things that he didn't understand before, but how much of this is just Chad Bowden with a big assist from Jen Cohen, creating an infrastructure and creating a staffing situation and an overall change of administrative competence that's just simply enabling Lincoln Riley's vision to become reality. How do we continue to calibrate and recalibrate that tension point at USC?
I think what we're seeing now is kind of a marriage of both of those things. I think that when I hear from Chad Bowden, he seems like somebody who came into the program kind of already knowing that the history behind this program, kind of already having a good idea of what it means to be a Trojan, to be a Trojan fan, to be a Trojan football player, what the program means to the local area, the football program has historically meant to local high school areas. And, it's hasn't especially felt to fans always that Lincoln Riley had that understanding fully when he first came in a few years ago. It's been hard for USC to replace someone like Pete Carroll, who just knew and understood this region so well and had such good relationships with people from, kind of all walks of LA, whether that was the football scene or, just other, different communities in Los Angeles. He was very, very active in the community and had a very informed understanding of just kind of all that was going on in the city and was really on the ground and really reaching out to people in that way. So, and you can't really fault Lincoln Riley for that completely. I mean, he's, kind of a Midwestern product and was at Oklahoma, and LA is a very, very different place. And USC's there's a lot of different kinds of schools all across the nation. But you can't really find something that is super comparable to what we all have here at USC. So I think it's unique. And I think he was very focused on what they were doing over there at Oklahoma. Obviously was enticed by what he could accomplish here at USC. So I think he has had to learn. We've talked to a lot of extent on this show about just kind of the different learning curves that he's had to undergo. And I think that he's embraced those. I think that a lot of the moves that he's made in the administration of the team and the coaching staff and all of that stuff, I think that that's shown that he's embraced, hey, I can learn. I'm not going to, stick to my guns too much. I can adjust. I can, try different strategies for these things. And I think that plus someone like Chad Bowden coming in, who already seems to have a lot of that background, even coming from Notre Dame, it's like the kind of the enemy or the opponent's view of what USC culture means. But Notre Dame fans know better than most other fan bases what USC football means to USC fans and USC players, because they have such an ingrained kind of vision of what that means, even from the opposite perspective. So that could have helped him in that regard. But I think it's kind of a bit of both, and I don't think one of them is more in play than the other. I think that they're working like a team at this point, and it may have taken Lincoln a little bit longer, but I think he's getting there now. So it's an encouraging thing to see in that regard for sure.
This is a talking point that it existed the day Lincoln Riley came to USC, and it's something you briefly alluded to. This guy is from Muleshoe, Texas. He's coached at Oklahoma for the past several years, and going to Los Angeles is a culture shock. But Lincoln Riley's a big boy coach, made 3 straight playoffs, won all those Big 12 championships. He was playing in the college football playoff semifinals 3 years running. He was on the biggest stage. Just in hindsight, not to relitigate, should USC have hired Lincoln Riley? Not trying to go there, not at all, because that was a home run hire. We were all incredulous on the day it happened, late November 2021. But in terms of just dealing with that particular point, he's coached in the midsection of America for several years. He's a Texas native. Um, was there something that perhaps could have and should have been communicated to him? Not that to the extent that it stood in the way of hiring him. Again, want to be very clear there. But do you think that like something slipped through the cracks in terms of imparting on him the importance of building that fence around Southern California, the thing that Clay Helton failed to do? Do you think that just in terms of Lincoln Riley knowing in full what the expectations of the job were? Obviously, he expected to win national championships and compete at the highest level. But in terms of the job of a USC coach and how you get there and how you do things the way Pete Carroll did, or at least how you get close to the formula Pete Carroll had, do you think something just got lost in translation? Do you think that there's a very specific reason that Lincoln Riley didn't really seem to get it in terms of forging really strong relationships with Southern California coaches? I mean, now things are in order. Like, this is how this is how the operation should be going. We can all see it. We can see Chad Bowden's immense influence, and also Jen Cohen helping to put this infrastructure into place. She deserves a lot of credit for that as well. We talked about it last year, before you were part of this show, but when I was with Tim Prangley, talked a lot about just getting the house in order. That has happened. But do you think that something did get lost or missed or overlooked in terms of telling Lincoln, hey, we love you here, we want you here, but you have to do things in Los Angeles that don't necessarily apply to Oklahoma or other jobs across the country?
Matt, I don't know exactly who to blame for this necessarily, so I'm not going to point fingers at anyone. The closest thing remotely that I can give to an explanation is like maybe the athletic director transition had something to do with it, because not a lot of people remember, just because Jen Cohen has come in and done such a home run job. But back when she was not the one who hired Lincoln Riley. It was Mike Bohn that hired Lincoln Riley, and obviously Mike Bohn had some different things kind of swirling around in the media about him, ended up stepping down, and then Jen Cohen gets promoted. And, maybe it was some distraction going on in that seat of the office. That's the only thing I can even begin to speculate, not pointing the fingers at anybody in particular, but just there was, bigger and more serious things going on with that seat of the program that, maybe a little bit less of the focus went towards acclimating Lincoln culturally, and they kind of trusted him more to do his coaching side of things, if that makes sense. But I think that one of the few kind of disappointing aspects of USC Trojan culture pretty consistently is the very reactionary nature of a lot of the people that are affiliated with it. And that's obviously none of our listeners here at the Voice of College Football. We have all the diehards here, obviously, but there's I think, and a lot of people blame it on the city, but because there's always, a lot of things happening in LA, a lot of exciting things, and it's, Hollywood, and there's never a dull night. USC fans and even, some of the like alums and higher up, like celebrity fans and all of that aren't always the most diehard, and, don't always show up when times aren't going so well. And it feels a little bit like with Lincoln Riley, it was like he needed to prove himself before some of these, people who had been around for a long time and could help him kind of acclimate himself to this program and knew a lot about this program that he probably didn't know, were going to show up and support him and kind of give him their stamp of approval. So I think that that's maybe a lesson to be learned here for some of those people. I would certainly like to see a little bit more of, an embracing of these people before they've done anything. And I understand that, you don't want to give anybody in this football program, which demands a lot of success, your full, kind of unhesitated support. The USC fans have always demanded accountability, and everyone in the USC program and everyone who's a Trojan always demands, kind of accountability for winning. And that's understandable, but you don't want that to kind of hold you back in such a way that you don't help these people do, kind of receive and do everything that they can do to win football games. So I think that the only thing that I can think of in that regard that may have made this a bit of a smoother transition is if just more people would have showed up and right away and been like, hey, we're excited about you. You're a winning football coach. Here's like everything about USC football culture. Whether that's guys like, celebrity fans or former players or former coaches, guys who know how to do the job. Some of those guys have shown up, but it seems like they showed up after, Caleb Williams' Heisman winning season and after they had a little bit of success and narrowly missed the college football playoff and not the moment he was hired, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so there's an interesting question that emerges hearing you speak and saying what you've said, and I my dad went to USC, but he went there in the 1960s. John McKay, very different time. So like I can't say personally, I didn't go to USC, unlike you. So I don't think I have the right to say things about the USC community or culture the way you do, because you're a USC Trojan, literally. I'm not. I have a family heritage or connection, but I didn't go to the school directly. But I do sense that that notion about there's so much going on in LA, and the sports dollar, it gets divided in a lot of different ways, and you snap fingers and 100,000 will show up at Tennessee for a cupcake from the Sun Belt, and it just doesn't work the same way at USC. But the really interesting thing that your words really unearthed for me is that when we talk about people not giving Lincoln Riley like his flowers right away, kind of having a kind of a wait and see attitude. My question for you, Ethan, kind of following that up, as though not giving Lincoln Riley total support right off the bat, wanting him to kind of earn it a little bit. That's understandable, especially since he did it at Oklahoma. So like there was the immediate expectation of, hey, we're shooting for the moon right away at USC. We're not trying to ease our way in. 9-3 is not good enough. I get that. Like, in USC fans having high standard, it's one of the things I love about USC fans. Like, they don't accept mediocrity very well. I love that. But in terms of fleshing out that point you made about like not giving him 100% robust support right off the bat and kind of having that little bit of a wait and see attitude, my follow-up, Ethan, is, do you think Lincoln Riley kind of sensed that he was going to be treated like a king? He was going to be received like the big cheese at local Southern California high schools, and that he maybe, like, he didn't feel he'd have to do as much diplomacy. He didn't have to, master his people skills right off the bat, that like Southern California high school coaches would just kind of, want to bring their prospects to USC, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Like Alex Grinch, the defense, separate conversation for sure. But, it seems as though Lincoln Riley might have taken for granted just a little bit that, well, of course, the top quarterbacks in Southern California are going to come to USC. Of course, the top receivers, running backs, they're going to want to play for me. Do you think that Lincoln Riley kind of took the market a little bit for granted precisely because of what you said, that not everybody gave him absolute full support? I mean, at least working within that thesis. Do you think that's really kind of why we saw this lag and these struggles and this stagnation over the past few seasons?
That could be it. I mean, it's a good theory that makes a lot of sense for sure. I think we've talked about how at Oklahoma, obviously, he's under Bob Stoops. He's kind of grandfathered into this program that has a great relationship with everybody. Everybody loved Bob Stoops. Nobody had a bad thing to say about him. He kind of is, a guy who benefits from being affiliated with Bob Stoops and his great relationships that he has with everyone in Oklahoma. And, coming into Southern California, it's obviously not the same deal. And I think, it could have been a lot of assumption of, hey, I've produced all these number one overall quarterbacks and all these Heisman winners, and And, you know, even his first year at USC, he was bringing over a lot of those top recruits that he'd gotten at Oklahoma, and they were following him to USC. And, you know, Caleb Williams being one of them, Mario Williams being another, and then Jordan Addison came over after, you know, being basically one of the best receivers in the country at Pitt. So it's not like that was disproven by the way that everybody kind of immediately followed him on the player side of things, at least in terms of transferring, not necessarily recruits, but in terms of transferring for sure. So I think so. I think that it's also just been an adjustment due to the new nature of college football. He kind of came in right when, you know, NIL was coming onto the scene as well. And I think that immediately kind of seemed to be a big benefit to USC, just given all the NIL opportunities that you can be afforded in Los Angeles. So it seemed like good timing there, but it is just another thing to juggle. That's a big reason why Chad Bowden is in the building in the first place, is because of, you know, kind of the GM nature of having to almost sign players to contracts now instead of just earn their commitment. So I think, you know, there's a variety of things. I think he was probably trying to figure out that new landscape just like everybody else was. But, you know, certainly I think anytime you go from a situation where everybody thinks you're great to a situation where nobody thinks anything of you at all, and in fact is kind of predispositioned to treat you with scrutiny until you prove that you don't deserve scrutiny and you instead deserve, you know, praise and support. That could have been it for sure.
One other thing you mentioned earlier in the show, which is worth discussing, and, you know, folks, you might be saying, you know, hey, why are we relitigating the past? Well, you know, first off, it's the month of May. So, you know, this is the time to kind of take a big picture view and, you know, to understand why things have improved at USC recently. I think it helps to put a spotlight, a magnifying glass on why things didn't work, because then we can compare both sides. Obviously, plenty of time to dig into the 2025 season, 2025 roster. And we're going to talk about some of the other new recruits that have been coming in recent days. But just, you know, just to kind of reiterate, like, it's worth having these reflections, especially since Ethan's, you know, relatively new to the show. Like, you know how Tim Prangley and I went at it on a lot of USC matters in previous years. But now Ethan and I are kind of developing our own conversational rapport, and, you know, being able to talk about the past, it kind of sets the table for talking about the present and talking about the future at USC. So, Ethan, another thing you did mention earlier was, you know, the change at athletic director, and that's a really important point, because so many of the established coaches, they had consistent, solid, steady relationships with one athletic director. So there was alignment, there was a mind meld, like the two men, the AD and the head coach, they knew what to expect from each other, knew how to work together. Like, you think of Dabo with Dan Radakovich for many years at Clemson before Radakovich went over to Miami. You know, you think of Greg Byrne and Nick Saban until Saban retired. You know, there was some continuity in the AD chair with the established head coach. Obviously, that's an important thing, and we can have a separate discussion about whether Mike Bohn should have been fired, deserved to be fired. But the Ethan's basic point is there was a change, and that had to have a disruptive element to it, and that had to play at least some kind of role in, you know, what Lincoln Riley was developing, maybe not continuing as steadily or as smoothly as it did. So, Ethan, it is really one of the big what ifs of USC football, you know, and Mike Bohn, say what you will about his personal private conduct, which is what got him fired. Man, he made some great hires. Lincoln Riley 1, Lindsey Gottlieb 2. And so we are left to wonder, you know, how things would have been if Mike Bohn, you know, had stayed on. And I think the thing to connect with Mike Bohn leaving, obviously Jen Cohen arriving, the thing that I've stressed in the past, talking with Tim Prangley and Mark Rogers as well, when Jen Cohen came aboard, all right, it was right before the 2023 season, and USC was picked to do big things, So obviously when Jen Cohen came aboard, she had to have been thinking, aha, I'm stepping into the perfect situation. The banquet table is all set for me, and I just get to inherit Lincoln Riley and Caleb Williams coming off, an 11-win New Year's Six Bowl season, making the Pac-12 championship game. This is the good life. I get to go to LA, and then it all falls apart. And so, we can blame Jen Cohen for being caught flat-footed, which she was. USC basically wasted that year, 2023 to 2024. That was a lost year. Like, it's not even a thundering indictment of Jen Cohen to say that. It's a year that got away, and that'll happen at other places too. And the thing about Jen Cohen, again, is that timing, that she came in when things were supposed to be great, and then they all collapsed in 2023. So, Ethan, we're kind of left with a situation where, it was less about Jen Cohen failing to give Lincoln Riley adequate support. It's more of, I would think, Ethan, and I want your take, it was more about 2023 was the year when Lincoln Riley needed to keep things rolling so that Jen Cohen's transition would have been smooth, so that Jen Cohen wouldn't have had to play catch up on the recruiting trail with Oregon, which she finally did. I mean, she finally, did something about that with the Chad Bowden hire, but it was less about Jen Cohen falling short in that year, 2023 to 2024, much more about Lincoln Riley not getting it done, not making sure that second and final year of Caleb Williams really counted. I think that's the way to look at that.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really blame Jen Cohen for this, certainly. And she's stepped in and done a great job. I mean, she was coming into, we mentioned, there were some allegations surrounding Mike Bonin. So like you said, having Lincoln Riley and having Caleb Williams is a great situation to come into, but replacing somebody that, has had a bit of a tumultuous end to their tenure is never a great feeling. And, there's always some challenges that come with that, especially when the allegations were of the nature that they were against Mike Bonin, her being who she is. But I think, yeah, it's, you can't really blame her for that one. And the fact of the matter is that on the football field, things didn't measure up to what they should have measured up to, given the talent that they'd had previously and the talent that was returning. So, and a lot of that chalks up to the defensive side of the ball. And, maybe Lincoln Riley not taking some of those other programs as seriously, because USC's 2022 schedule was very easy compared to their 2023 schedule, which was a lot more difficult, with some programs like Notre Dame making improvements, but then also some programs like Oregon just being teams that they didn't play in 2022 and then teams that they ended up playing the next year in 2023. So, but, we can kind of throw darts at the dartboard about like lack of familiarity with opponents, too much trust in the defensive coordinator, but it's kind of like you said, the fact of the matter is that it was a lost year, and they wasted a Heisman quarterback, the future number 1 overall pick, who somehow stayed the number 1 overall pick because he was that talented, despite the kind of, disastrous season that his team experienced at USC. But yeah, I would agree with you wholeheartedly on the Jen Cohen point, though. I don't think that you can blame her for something like that. It's a tough situation to step into, and since then, and the moves she's made, the hires she's made with the football program and elsewhere have been home runs. So I wouldn't place any blame on her. I don't think there's any reason to doubt her abilities, and I think moving forward, USC fans should have full confidence in her for sure.
All right, so we said we were going to talk more about the incoming recruits. Obviously, Xavier Griffin out, but more recruits in. So, like, the overall numbers over the past week, the size of this recruiting class has still managed to go up. People coming in are still eclipsing the number of people going out. So, Ethan, your observations on just the continued steady stream, like that's the thing that really hits me and really stands out. Like, it's not a trickle, it's not an occasional thing here or there scattered. The steadiness of this, just pulling in one and another and another and another, and just like it's not stopping. That is just the eye-popping thing, because like we've missed this. We have not. It's almost hard to remember what this was like. It's been a long time since USC has had this conveyor belt type quality to a recruiting class. Obviously, you want the quality, but USC is also bringing the quantity. So your reaction to this latest batch of recruits and any other particularly noteworthy elements of this recent continuation of this 2026 surge?
Yeah, I mean, every time I prepare for the show every week, I do a lot of scanning social media pretty constantly. I'm always keeping up with all of the USC football news on social media. And it feels like every week there's multiple social media posts that I'm pulling back up as I'm making my show notes that are about new commitments every single week. There's never a dull week in that regard. And this week it's been the two standout commitments have been defensive guys, and they've both been guys from Southern California. So I think that both of those are encouraging signs. With the news of Xavier Griffin leaving, that's obviously a linebacker. They also got a commitment from a linebacker, Taylor Johnson, who's from San Bernardino. And then they also got a commitment from 4-star edge Sean Scott, who's from Inland Empire. So a lot of movement continues on the defensive side of the ball, and a lot of movement continues in Southern California, both of which is really encouraging, and both doesn't really feel like it would have been feasible 2 years ago, pre-Danton Lynn and pre-Chad Bowden. So those two guys coming in has really strengthened those two sides of things for sure. And yeah, I mean, like you said, it's every week. I fully anticipate having more recruits to talk about next week. We talked about several recruits last week. They're talking about recruits on the other show that happens Monday night here on the Voice of College Football at 6 p.m. So there's just always recruits to talk about, and it makes it really exciting. I feel like, I feel like any day I could get a Twitter notification or see an Instagram post about a new commitment, and see one of those new graphics that somebody's committed to USC. And that's always really exciting. And I hope that continues, because it makes the offseason fun, and it kind of helps me, feel even more proud of the university that I went to, that we just have so many of these young football players who want to play at USC, and, want to play at USC despite there likely being stiff competition for playing time because of all of the other top recruits that have all committed to USC. So it's really exciting. It keeps it really fun. It's made the offseason really engaging. It makes our show a lot more interesting for sure. And I until it stops, I fully anticipate seeing more of these commitments and having more to talk about every week, because that's how it's been thus far. So I don't see why it wouldn't be that way next week and all the weeks in the future.
All right, folks, more on recruiting and also on the new assistant strength coach, not the chief strength coach, but the assistant, also coming aboard from Kansas State. Those two topics right after we do this 1-minute commercial from one of our sponsors here at the Voice of College Football. We'll be back on the other side in 1 minute.
You can make a difference here at the Voice of College Football. Use the Amazon link. Financially contribute to the Voice of College Football without spending a penny. Same shopping experience. It's easy. Go to any video on any channel. Go to the description section and grab the link right next to the capital letters that say Amazon. Use that link, and Amazon will instantaneously convert to your account, settings, history, everything intact, just like whatever link you use right now. No difference. Pay no attention to the product that you see right there. Just go search what you want. Don't forget the Amazon link. Thank you for your support. Sincerely, the Voice of College Football.
All right, so that's our 1-minute advertisement, and I might add, whether it's the USC channel or any team channel or just the national channel, I know that Mark Rogers and the other administrators here at the Voice of College Football, if you're a business looking to sponsor a show in a team or in a market, including USC in Los Angeles, feel free to get in touch with Mark Rogers. You can tweet the Voice of College Football at the VOCFB. If you want to just forward something to me, myself, or to Ethan about a USC show sponsorship, we're open for business, to be sure. So think about sponsoring a show or the national market, the national site, the Voice of College Football. All right. So as we continue, Ethan, and we continue with recruiting, because that's what May is all about. That's what the offseason is all about. Like, Big Ten Media Days are in mid-July. Can't get here fast enough. Then it's really the season. Love that. But right now it's still kind of recruiting being the main focus. ESPN came out with its new updated set of 2026 recruiting rankings. And so the worldwide leader has USC still at number 1. Two other really interesting notes that USC fans will be interested in. Ohio State number 2. So the Buckeyes right on the heels of USC. So you have 2 Big Ten teams. Still feels so weird to say that. USC and Ohio State 1, 2. But then where's Waldo? Where's Dan Lanning? Where's Oregon? In these new ESPN rankings published this week, just like in the past 24 to 48 hours, Oregon is number 11. And Oregon is number 11, having picked up Richard Wesley, that 5-star, the other day. So USC 10 whole spots ahead of Dan Lanning and Oregon. And it's USC and Ohio State right up there at the very top. We can hash these out and slice them and chop them and dice them any way we want. Ethan, you've probably gotten this question before, and I think a lot of fans, think about it all the time. They think about it every year, but let's see what you think about this. What do you think is a significant gap in recruiting rankings in the caliber of a class? And of course, rankings are just rankings; they're just projections. Players can be busts. Players can be 3-stars and they become superstars. They either have that it factor or just the rating services were off. They make mistakes. They make misses. But Mark Rogers does say, like, recruiting rankings are there for a reason. Like, they're talking about the aggregate, talking about the bulk, the volume. It's kind of like analytics. You load up, you have more chances, more swings, more bites at the apple, whatever metaphor you want. And having that depth and having more 4-stars, more 5-stars generally does translate into better results, better performance. Like Ohio State did have the best players in college football last season. That was the consensus going in, and it was certainly the consensus going out. So viewed through that prism, like the ratings or the rankings of players, of prospects, were not fundamentally off the mark. Some individual misses here and there, but generally in aggregate, overall, they were generally right. So with that in mind, what feels significant for you in terms of a gap in recruiting rankings? 3 spots, 7 spots, or in the case of USC versus Oregon right now, according to ESPN, 10 spots. What do you think really matters in terms of gaps in recruiting rankings?
Well, I think if you ask USC fans, even 1 is a significant gap in recruiting ranking, especially when it comes to Oregon, right? USC and Oregon fans are always going back and forth on social media. And if it was USC 1, Oregon 2, USC fans would still be kind of handing it to Oregon fans on social media. But I think that when it comes to the USC Oregon situation, I think that there is currently a significant gap between the two. Obviously, especially considering what you said, they get a 5-star guy in there. And that still, keeps them outside of the top 10, which USC is obviously at the top of. So, I don't really know particularly what's going on over at Oregon, that they're, not getting off the ground as much as they have in recent years, time and time again. But I do think that I kind of want to focus for my point on the guys at number 1 and number 2. Because I do think that there is kind of a theme between USC and Ohio State, even though it may not appear to be so. Ohio State obviously being the team that just made and won the national championship last season. So obviously they're coming fresh off of that momentum. They can point to this and say, hey, we're a team that can win a national championship in the mid-2020s. So if you want to win, if you're competitive, like nearly all of college football players are, and you want to win ultimate glory as a college football player, you can come here, and it's hard to argue with. It's hard to argue with the trophy. But obviously, Chad Bowden is someone who comes from Notre Dame, which was the team that was runner-up in college football, the team that had made the college football national championship game last year and then lost to Ohio State. So, Chad isn't necessarily benefiting from the same brand, the same logo, working with Marcus Freeman anymore in terms of being a, fresh off a national championship appearance, college football GM, but he is still fresh off of that. And there seems to be something there, whether it's just that he learned in his time how to recruit good players. A lot of that came to fruition in 2024, and now he's applying what he learned in 2025. Or, a lot of these players do find that significant. I'm not sure how much college football players, take into significance the reputation of the general manager, especially since it's such a new position of these college football programs. But it seems like it could have played a factor in it for sure, especially because this class seems to be giving recent success a lot of weight. And obviously, Dan Lanning in Oregon is a program that has had a lot of recent success by their standards. But they're also a program that, Dan Lanning talks a lot of big game, but they haven't been able to deliver when it matters. And, whether that's 2 years ago, losing twice to Washington, not making the college football playoff, whether that was last year, kind of running away with the number 1 overall seed only to get embarrassed by Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, whether it's either of those things. I think players are probably taking Oregon a little less seriously than Ohio State, certainly, and that certainly makes sense. But it seems like Chad Bowden is also inspiring more belief in a lot of these players than a program like Oregon, and hopefully, a lot of that extends to Lincoln Riley. And I think a lot of players still obviously do believe in Lincoln Riley, and especially his offensive ability, like we've talked about in this episode. And, they believe in Jen Cohen. They believe in Danton Lynn, who came in and turned this program's defense around immediately and is sure to do an even better job next year. So we seem to be building a staff that a lot of these players believe in, even if USC has never made a college football playoff in the modern era, has never reached that kind of glory. We do have guys in the building who have reached that kind of glory and have shown, a little bit of positive turn in the program in terms of getting those kind of guys in the building. So I would hope that, and I do think that, especially given Ohio State being at number 2, that is inspiring some belief in some of these recruits.
One important note, and this kind of ties into our earlier conversation, and really beyond it's the big ongoing conversation at USC. The balance of between Lincoln Riley getting things right and doing things better, and Chad Bowden kind of creating the new structure, the new influence, the new points of emphasis that are leading to these recruiting gains. I think one area where Lincoln Riley really does deserve credit. I don't think it's the Southern California coaches. I think that's definitely a Chad Bowden check mark right there. That's a Bowden thing. But where Lincoln Riley has improved recruiting and has put USC in a better position to recruit well, his defensive staff. Like, that's the tangible area to me where Lincoln Riley has put USC football in a better position to acquire defensive talent. Now, of course, this comes from staying with Alex Grinch 1 year too long. We know that. But he made some really, really good hires. And it's not just Danton Lynn. It's not just Coach Henney. Now, Rob Ryan. Rob Ryan has been credited. I've read some of the recent articles from 247 and the other recruiting sites that Rob Ryan is responsible for some of the recent linebacker polls that USC's been able to make on the trail. So it really seems as though the professionalization of the defensive coaching staff is a really central reason why USC's better. And that definitely goes in Lincoln Riley's column, not Chad Bowden's.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, who wouldn't want to play for Rob Ryan? I want to play for Rob Ryan, right? He's a guy with incredible energy and just a great personality, kind of a one-of-one personality that you can't find anywhere else. And that's not going to work with everybody. You know, maybe it didn't work with Xavier Griffin, and that's why he started looking elsewhere. Obviously, he plays the linebacker position, but it's going to work with a lot of people because he comes with that reputation, but he also comes with just, you know, a super fun personality. He's always incredible to watch and be around in interviews. And so, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree on that point, and excited to see what he does. I'm sure, you know, he's going to be a must watch on the field and in this program going forward.
Yeah, and we shouldn't forget Matt Entz did a great job in his 1 year at USC. Obviously, if you're getting the Fresno State job, which, you know, it's a group of 5 job, but it's a high end group of 5 job. A guy named Kalen DeBoer was head coach at Fresno State. Used that as a stepping stone. Like, you know, if you're Fresno State head coach, chances are you're a good coach. Like Jeff Tedford, Pat Hill, like lots of really good coaches coach at Fresno State. So the fact that USC was able to send Matt Entz to Fresno State, obviously an indication of how good Matt Entz was in his 1 year. So, you know, in the testimonials that Matt Entz did receive, and now the testimonials that Rob Ryan is receiving, man, doesn't that tell so much of the story in terms of just USC being more professional, being more adult? Like, this is what a big boy program looks like, feels like. This is how it is supposed to work. You know, also in terms of recruiting, Penn State is you know, another prominent Big Ten name school on the recruiting landscape. And, you know, last week, Ethan, I asked you about Oregon in terms of, you know, if the Ducks don't get something big done on the field the next 2 seasons, are they ever going to do it? And obviously USC fans are hoping, no, yeah, if Oregon doesn't do it now, clock's going to run out, because, you know, USC is eclipsing the Ducks on the recruiting trail now. So tick, 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 tick up in Eugene. Let's apply that to Penn State, right? Because you have Drew Aller coming back. You have a lot of high-end players coming back from a semifinal team last season. So really, Ethan, I'm going to ask you the same question about Penn State that I asked you about Oregon a week ago. You know, if Penn State doesn't pounce on this opportunity, and we can talk national championship, but at least make the national title game, I think that would be. I think this season is like all in. You know, put all your chips in the middle of the table for Penn State this season. If James Franklin slips on the banana peel, if he steps on the rake, like, is he ever going to get a better look at the national title in Happy Valley? Like, do you think this season is really the defining season for Penn State's you know, long-term big picture trajectory, such that if the Nittany Lions stumble, USC is going to be ahead of Penn State in 2026 and beyond? How big a year do you think this is for Penn State in the Big Ten?
I think it's a massive year. I think that you're right on all of your points. I think, you know, compared to Oregon, we talked about Oregon last week, and I said that obviously Oregon fans are getting a little impatient, but it's not, you know, given their program history and given, you know, the kind of way that Dan Lanning has really surpassed a lot of that and kind of elevated the program. It doesn't feel like a firing for him or any major program changes would be imminent. But I think in the Penn State situation is completely different. I think, especially given you mentioned Drew Aller coming back, there's a lot of people that call him, you know, the best and most talented returning quarterback in the Big Ten. And there's even people who consider him amongst the best returning quarterbacks in the nation, period. So I think his talent is not to be kind of understated or underemphasized. He's a very, very talented guy, should be drafted very highly in, you know, the 2026 NFL draft, obviously. And James Franklin is also a guy who's beginning to build a reputation for a guy that can't get it done, because he's, you know, gotten very, very close several times. And, you know, it doesn't feel like Penn State fans or any fans across the country really have a lot of faith in him to be able to get it done in, you know, come playoff time, come January. So I think like you said, they need to have a bit more success. A first or second round win in the newly revamped college football playoff isn't quite going to do it. Last year, it's like, oh, at least, they got to win in December, January against a top team, but it's not, especially this year with bigger expectations, Drew Aller having the year that he had. I think it could be a lot more critical. And especially if Penn State has kind of the same year that they did last year, maybe you see them, giving James Franklin one more chance, seeing what he can muster out of, their next quarterback, their next class of players. But if it's similar to this kind of season that USC had in 2023 off of their, kind of sustained success, and, Penn State is a kind of middle of the road team and kind of wastes Drew Aller's talent, kind of the same way that USC wasted Caleb Williams' talent, I think you could see, them moving on from him for sure.
All right, want to tend to a little bit of business here. Rob Latham talking about Coach Rob Ryan, but Rob has voiced concerns about being blocked. Rob, just want to address this directly. On the previous iteration of this show, I was not in charge of blocking people. So I don't know why you are blocked. I want to address that. If there's a way to reinstate you, great. But I would obviously have to run it up the flagpole in terms of management. So your concerns are noted. Would love to be able to unblock you, but that's something for which I would need permission. All right, because maybe the higher ups think you should be blocked. I don't know. All right, this show's gone through a transition. But anyway, your concerns are noted. They will be brought up to management. So just had to tend to that bit of business. Want to do some little customer service here at the Voice of College Football. All right, so continuing on with our show and continuing to talk about recruiting here, we have a comment from Gixxer Squid, one of our longtime friends here on the USC channel. Matt, and I'll put this to Ethan as well. Do you attribute our recent recruitment success to coaching, NIL, recruitment fit? FYI, so happy Benny Wiley is gone. We've been advocating for that. Yes, we have. And we'll talk a little bit more about the strength and conditioning program in a little bit. But just Gixxer, very simply, like the recruiting success, one thing I mentioned earlier that Ethan also talked about is just how steady the recruiting wins are. Like, it's not just occasional, an occasional drips and drabs. It's a soaker. It's a downpour. It is raining hard with new top athletes at USC. So when you get that kind of steady, consistent, elite performance, and it happened right after Chad Bowden came. This did not happen before Chad Bowden came aboard. So I think we can say they got the right general manager. They got the professional expertise. We talked about this so much, Gixxer, last year with Tim Prangley, that, what's going on? Where's the administrative structure? They're supposed to be, smart guys figuring it out, who know how the process works, who know how to structure everything. This was structure. The NIL and the administrative room, the people in the room did not know what to do, how to do it. Chad Bowden has instantly brought the professional product, mindset, know-how, like he did it at Notre Dame, comes to USC, and it happens right away. That is not an idle coincidence. So Ethan, anything to add just in terms of, attributing our recruiting success, and maybe, how Jen Cohen figures into this. She hired Chad Bowden. Obviously Chad Bowden is the one who made things happen, but I think it was just a sense of someone finally realized that we just have to have the right. It was less about, can you recruit? It's more of, does he know how to structure the office, the operation? That was really the hurdle that USC had to get past. It wasn't so much like, can you close the sale? It's, can you run a shop? Like, can you run an operation? This goes back to, something that we talked about before, is that Dave Emmerich was supposedly the general manager, but he really wasn't hired as a quote unquote general manager, that he kind of held the position, but several years ago, the rapid change in this business, Ethan, the way a general manager functions today in 2025, it was not the same when Dave Emmerich originally came aboard. So there was just so much change, and it just took a little while for Jen Cohen to realize, okay, what we actually need in a GM, it's the job description's different, a couple years later.
I do want to emphasize both Gixer's and your point on NIL, because I think, talking about Chad Bowden, talking about the changes in college football, a lot of that all kind of ties back into NIL and just the changing landscape. And I think that, as a student at USC, in my 4 years, and I'm kind of coming up on the end of my last year as a student and graduating here in a few days. But I think something that I've really seen take off, has been just recruiting, and not just in football, but kind of across all of the sports. I feel like when I arrived on campus in 2021, I'm a big sports fan, so I was still excited about a lot of things, but a lot of, these USC programs had a lot of history that I was excited about, and a couple of prominent players. The basketball team was coming off of its March Madness run that same year. So, there's a little bit of excitement there because that was the furthest run that they'd made in the modern era, kind of, but it didn't feel as though USC was a nationally prominent program in a lot of these sports at the time. And obviously, with the exception of beach volleyball, where Dane Blanton has done just an incredible job, and they've won, 4 straight national championships, and then and they won that my first year as well. But with that exception, it felt like USC was kind of middling around in a lot of these sports. And then the NIL news came out that first year, and then everything just kind of exploded. It kind of started with the Lincoln Riley hire, and it started with Lincoln Riley bringing in Caleb Williams and bringing in, Jordan Addison and Travis Dye and a lot of those guys. But it extended to a lot of other sports as well. Men's basketball hasn't had a lot of recent success. They've kind of, wasted some of the incredible talent. But the fact of the matter remains that they did bring in Bronny James, and they did bring in Isaiah Collier. And, Isaiah Collier was the #1 recruit in the country, and Bronny James was a guy who, brought in a lot of that same excitement. And, there was a lot of hype, even if it wasn't fulfilled, at least. And then on the women's basketball side of things, obviously, USC fans know well, bringing in Juju Watkins and how that's transformed the program, and bringing in, 3 5-stars the following year, including Kennedy Smith, who's obviously sticking around, and we're very grateful for that. And then, going into next year, bringing in Jazzy Davidson, who's the #1 player in the country again. And even baseball, baseball's kind of gone through the ringer a bit in my first couple of years. They brought in a new coach, and now they're on the turnaround, and they very well could be seeing the College Baseball World Series this year. So I think the kind of through line through all of that, even aside from football, has been NIL, and has been excitement around the kind of NIL branding partnerships and opportunities that you can have in a place like LA, where it's, there's a lot of brands that kind of make LA their home. There's a lot of, ties to Hollywood, just a lot of general excitement around pop culture, and it's kind of the pop culture capital of the world even. So I think NIL is something that should be emphasized. I think that's one of the reasons that Chad Bowden has been brought in, is to kind of, help flex USC's NIL opportunities, and help kind of, utilize that market that USC's done a decent job of utilizing, but probably could have been doing even more to do, especially, not having a guy in Chad Bowden's seat who's like kind of dedicated to that NFL free agent GM role. So I think that NIL could and should be playing a huge role for a program like USC. And I definitely want to emphasize that point.
This is an interesting little comment from our friend Jeff Rodriguez. And hey, Jeff, it's great to connect with a lot of our friends on the show from past seasons. Once again, this show's gone through some transitions. We went dark for a couple of months, several weeks. Great to kind of reconnect, get the band back together here. Jeff says someone needs to send Bowden an email about the point of getting the collie filled. Even lower ticket prices for those games no one cares about. The Utah State games, yeah, the other kind of low end conference games like Rutgers as well. Ethan, what do you think? $5 nosebleed seats at the Coliseum, or maybe like a family pack, like $20 gets you a game ticket, a hot dog, a drink, and maybe and a parking spot. Like you don't make money from tickets you don't sell. So maybe like for the lower end games, like you don't need to worry about the high end games like Michigan. You're going to fill the joint for that. But for the lower end games like a Rutgers, which by the way, like last year that was played on the same night that Freddie Freeman did his thing in Game 1 of the World Series. So obviously, like it was always going to be a rough sell to get USC fans to come to the ball yard for Rutgers. But like for those lower end games, it would seem that like it's a natural thing to offer really cheap ticket prices, because at least you're getting more people in the building. And again, if you don't buy tickets, you don't get any revenue at all. Seems like a decent thing for USC to do, and it would make sense.
Yeah, that's kind of something that I've really thought about a lot in my time as a student. That in particular, kind of offering cheaper tickets, because coming to a USC game is hard, and they shouldn't pretend like it isn't. Like traffic is always difficult. There's not a lot of places to park, and the places that you can park are really expensive. It's just, driving in LA is difficult. Like it takes a lot of mental energy, especially when there's so many other things to do and in our current age when there's so much entertainment just at your fingertips. So I think, appealing to the fans is something that they should try. And that might mean lowering prices. I think it could also mean just kind of upping their promotional game. I know a lot of other sports, the basketballs especially, have done a lot of, like t-shirt giveaways, hoodie giveaways, incentivizing especially students to kind of get out to the games. And it feels like USC football doesn't really do that too much. Like I think the only item that I can ever remember receiving for free at a USC game is like a poster. Like there's never, or, sometimes at a spring game, they'll give away a t-shirt or, like a hat or something like that, but they don't even do the spring game anymore. There's not that kind of fan event of appealing to fans in that way. And I don't think that that's like necessarily like a shameful thing to admit that you need to do that. Like the best and most, desired and hottest tickets in all of professional sports all still do promotions. You need promotions to get fans out to those Tuesday night games if you're in the NBA, or those random Wednesday games, and some of the Friday night games in Major League Baseball. Like they keep it exciting. They keep these games something to distinguish these games. And yeah, when when it's not Dodgers versus Giants, or when it's not Lakers versus Warriors, or when it's not Kings versus Ducks, like you need something to incentivize fans to put in all of that effort to come out to the stadium. And I think that could be a way to do it as well. And lowering ticket prices is obviously something people always want, but if you're not going to lower ticket prices, at least give fans an extra incentive to come out. And my thought has always been to look into being a little bit better about promotions and just kind of fan relations in that way.
Absolutely. Okay, winding down the show, Ethan, and we said we were going to talk about this, so we better make sure to talk about it. Lonnie Maddox, he's the assistant strength coach. He joins lead head strength coach Tremaine Carroll, and coming from Kansas State. So, Ethan, the obvious point is the point that's worth making and emphasizing here, is that this elite strength coach that USC thinks it has found, and we think Tremaine Carroll is an elite strength coach. Hey, you can't go wrong with Coach Carroll at USC, right? But if you have an elite big dog as your strength coach, it certainly would stand to reason that you need to get his lieutenant. You need to get that second in command to help spread throughout the room, create that culture, create the quality control, maintain the standard. That seems like a really important hire for USC.
No, certainly. And I think it should be emphasized too that this is not like one of those situations where Lincoln Riley brought in a bunch of coaches that were his guys and they were looking over, a lot of their kind of lack of strengths in certain areas. This is not necessarily a guy that Tremaine Carroll has a super long-standing relationship with. They only worked together last year at Kansas State. But Lonnie Maddox is someone who has been involved in the strength and conditioning game for a decent bit of time. I mean, he was the head of strength and conditioning himself at Valdosta State before going to Kansas State, and he's also been in the same position at Alcorn State for several years. So, these are not massive programs, but he is a guy who not only knows what it's like to be in a strength and conditioning program, but to run a strength and conditioning program. So I think that it's just another guy in the building who's really smart, knows what he's doing. And if Tremaine Carroll trusts him and USC trusts Tremaine Carroll, I don't see why USC should then not trust Lonnie Maddox.
All right. Lots of good things at USC. And isn't it great for Jeff Rodriguez and Rob Latham and, people that we know well on this show in the chat? Isn't it great, guys, that, we're talking about a program that's headed up and making good, sound, adult, responsible decisions? That really feels good. So that's the note on which we'll close our show. And so, again, you can join Ethan and myself, Matt Zemek, every Wednesday here on USC Trojans Primetime Live. We're part of the USC channel at the Voice of College Football. Check out the Tuesday USC show coming at you Tuesday nights. And a reminder, the Voice of College Football now has a written website, vocfb.com, news, insights, at least 4 stories per day, every day at vocfb.com, the Voice of College Football. We want you to come here for all of the live broadcasts such as this one. But in addition to watching our shows, we also have a written website for you to enjoy, and we're going to give you the complete coverage of the 2025 college football season on our website, vocfb.com. Be sure you're checking it out. We're going to have plenty on, where Trojans and also where prominent, top draft picks are going to be playing in the NFL this season with the NFL schedule release. That's obviously the kind of the low-hanging fruit that we're going to go after the next few days. So check out vocfb.com, our website. And, of course, we'll see you next Wednesday, Ethan and myself, here at the USC channel on the Voice of College Football. Have a great week, everybody.